Okay. So, Rhea, first of all, welcome to my podcast. Um, Out of the Hood with Hamza is a podcast for the people by the people. So it's always been like a mission at the podcast to sort of just bring stories or create content that people can
Right,
just take from on a day-to-day basis. And it's
right,
basically it runs on the fact that everyone has some or the other story to share and people can benefit from it, right? uh,
right.
my whole purpose with doing this podcast with you is also like, I think, a personal therapy session also, because there are quite a few
Mm,
questions that aren't answered yet in my
right.
entrepreneurship journey. And I believe that a lot of people face similar problems, or if I don't have to call it a problem, maybe like
The
obstacles,
challenge. Yeah,
challenges that they sort of
yeah.
need answers to. So I have a few of them, and I have included, like, I'm going to include like a long introduction of yours before this, so we can sort of just skip that part. I want to start
Sure.
by asking you a question about on the lines of decision making, right? So I have just
Okay.
started my own business, and there are a lot of things that I do on a day-to-day basis, whether that's like content creation, so making reels, or then taking business
Right.
meetings, or just like stuff like that, right? And in all of this, I feel like when you need to do decision making on a day-to-day basis, you need a lot of clarity. And sometimes you
Yeah,
lose that because you're preoccupied with a lot of things. So
right.
according to you, how do you think you can gain that clarity, or things you could do to have clarity on a day-to-day basis in your routine?
I think that uh, when you think about the word clarity, right, it's almost like we're all working towards this ideal notion of wanting to make very authentic decisions, very, crystal clear goals. And I think that a large part of that decision making involves knowing a lot about yourself. And I think that we skip that part out, even though it's one of the largest parts, because it's so daunting. It's so daunting to think of that in order to make a very aligned or authentic decision, I need to know so many parts of me that I'm not even aware exists. Because on a day-to-day basis, that we're making like a million decisions, right? Whether they're micro decisions, whether they're macro decisions, whether it's something as macro as the next, year's goals for your company, or it is something as micro as what am I going to eat for lunch today. All of these decisions are somehow culminated from, whether it's instinct, whether it's cognition, whether it's your gut, whether it's your programming, your conditioning. There are so many forces that are going behind this. So I think that when we think about decision making as a whole, why I really encourage sort of therapeutic journeys being a large part that can abet and assist one, in the process of decision making is very important, because what you're doing when you're say exploring and learning about yourself on your therapeutic journey is you're asking questions about yourself, right? Why am I making the decisions I am making? We're just not making them out of our traumas or our conditioning, right? So if I say, for instance, if I've watched my dad, since we're talking about decision making in entrepreneurship or in decision
Right.
making in businesses, if I've watched my father run a business and a company in a certain way, the chances that I'm going to model that behavior, Hamza, are so high, because this is how I watched him deal with his
Yeah.
staff. The chances that I have imprinted that, whether I align with it or I don't, I'm going to model that just because of my pure conditioning. But when I stop down and I think to myself, is this really the way I want to interact with my staff? Is this really the way I want to interact with my manager, my CEO? I realize in those moments that no, maybe I don't want to interact with them at this point. But it's only when I take a moment to stop and reflect. Because if I'm not stopping and I'm not reflecting, I'm going to probably do the same thing without recognizing. And that's, even though it might appear it's clear, a clear decision that I want to, deal with them this way, it's not really that clear because it's not authentic to you. So I kind of connect clarity and authenticity together, right? Like the more authentic we are becoming with ourselves, the clearer and the more aligned goals we're making for ourselves, the more attuned goals we're making for ourselves, because it's that's the person you're becoming versus the person, say, your environment wants you to become or your parents want you to become. So it's a little convoluted. I wish I had more direct tips and
I know, I understand.
tricks as to
Yeah.
how clear we can make clear decisions. But I think that it goes learning about ourselves is a large part of making clear decisions. Because when you look back in retrospect or in hindsight of certain decisions that you have made, you think to yourself, I made this decision in my 20s, okay, to start this entrepreneurial adventure, because in those moments these were the factors that seemed most aligned to me. You're able to call it a clear decision, not, oh my god, I don't know what I was doing, or I don't know how I landed up here, because in that moment it was most authentic to you. But the only way we get that is by learning very deeply about ourselves. And, I mean, of course, I encourage therapeutic processes that allow for that. But there are so many ways we can learn more about ourselves, right? Whether it's self-reflection, whether it's just spaces to introspect, any safe space where you can vulnerably share the kind of person you want to become. All of that helps that process.
Got it, got it. For me personally, I had the awareness to even understand that, my mind is sort of clogged with this kind of decision making, or I need answers. So I have that awareness
Yeah,
personally. But a lot of people that I talk to are not aware, right? And
right.
as you said, like you need to introspect and stuff. So, like, to gain
Mm-hmm.
that awareness, to even come to the decision that, okay, I need therapy to make this,
Right.
to solve this challenge. What do you think is the key to that? Like, how do I become aware to even take that first
Mm.
step?
Yeah, I think that to even get to a point where we recognize that, oh, I think talking it out with somebody who is considered to be a professional in this space is helpful. I think it clearly starts from this idea of stopping and thinking. Right, because I think that even though something so simple, I think there is an element of just having to take a step back before we make any decision for ourselves, and just taking a second to rethink it and reevaluate and reassess it. I don't think we do that, right? Like, even when it comes to smaller micro decisions, we are products of so much programming and cultural conditioning, right? There's so much cultural conditioning in the way we interact, in our responses, the way we deal with things on a day-to-day basis, that nobody is really stopping and reflecting. So, for example, like, I know it's a little divergent from that, entrepreneurial examples that we're using earlier on, or any sort of, individual who is starting their own venture. Say a girl at the ages of 22 and 23, her default setting is going to be, now it's time to get married. Or her default setting when she touches 26 is, I have to have children. But because it's very conditioned, you're primed,
Right.
you're over years, that's what you're primed to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we don't need, a lot of people, Hamza, I met you, like, but like, we know what needs to be done, this is what needs to be done now and then, right? The developmental milestones our society has laid out for us so concretely that technically we don't need awareness. Because if you follow this path that your parents and grandparents and society is telling you to do, you're going to get max social validation, right? The people that are actually stopping to think, right? So, for instance, instead of starting an entrepreneurial venture, imagine going for your regular corporate job or becoming a doctor, Hamza. That's what the path
Yeah.
is. But you have stopped somewhere in the midst of this journey, in this rat race where people are following. You have stopped and you have asked yourself, what is it that aligns for me in the here and now? Where do I want to put my energies? What are my value systems? My value systems, I want to have social impact. My value systems, I want to make lots of money. Whatever the value system is, right? There's an element that you have stopped and you have taken a second to ask yourself, is this what I want? And that, I think, is the first step. Even though we might not have deep amounts of awareness to get to that eventually, or the tools, and that's where maybe therapy assists you at. But to get to that point, it's about stopping and asking ourselves, do I want to get married at 22? Everyone around me, that's what they're doing. Everyone around me is telling me that's the right thing to do. But is it right for me, based on my milestones, based on the woman I want to become, right? So I think that pausing is really important. Pausing, because then we're talking about awareness and reflection as being more ultimate goals, or eventually
Yeah.
that's where we want to land up. We want to make every decision with utter clarity, with
Yes.
utter authenticity, in that state of conscious attention that most of us are not, really, we all of us haven't attained that meditative state yet. But this whole idea of pausing, and I think unlearning, right? Like, unlearning that what is success for other people might not be success for me. Unlearning that my path is going to be different from that. And I think unlearning is the second step, right? I think, but pausing and questioning is the first. So I think of, like, questioning or challenging what we've inherited or what is given to us, and then unlearning that. I might realize that after I ask myself all of these questions at 22, I yet want to get married at 22, and that's fine,
Mhm.
right? But at least I did that emotional, relational labor with myself to know this is what I really, really want. And if not, unlearning the system and saying, what do I want and how do I get there? And that's usually a space where we need some amount of assistance, right? Like,
Got
I
it.
don't want this, but
Yeah.
I don't know how to navigate it. I need some tools, I need some resources, I need something to build the life I really want to live. If that
Yeah, yeah.
somewhat
No,
answers your
I
question.
think that gives you a
Okay.
lot of clarity because I think the major problem is that you know everything, you just don't know how to put it
Mm.
in front of you. I think that's where it helps. Okay,
Yeah.
moving ahead. Like a lot of people in my circle and my age group start out like they decide on okay,
Right.
this is what I want to pursue and I want to go ahead with this. But we are very impatient with results and we want
Mm.
everything
Mm.
quick and we
Right.
know that consistency pays off and being patient pays off
Right.
in the end, but we still can't
Sure.
exercise it. So how do you think you can get that? I don't know if I should call it get patience, maybe that's not the right way to say it, but just
Mm.
be able to
Right.
make sure that that end goal, like you can stay committed to that journey,
Sure.
because sometimes you have thoughts in your head that okay, maybe it's not working after a few tries, time to drop the
Yeah.
idea, right? uh,
Sure.
so being consistent I think is important. How do you think, like, how should people pursue that?
Yeah, I think that I resonate a little bit more with you when you say about how maybe our generations, the generations to come as well, we've been exposed to, and I guess not so much we, but maybe, the Gen Z, are
Yeah.
exposed to so much stimuli that instant gratification is what we desire, right? That's kind of what you're alluding to, this idea that, okay, this is not working really quickly, I'm going to move on to something else. And I think that, um, while instant gratification is something that we're all seeking for on our day-to-day basis when it comes to starting something of your own, or building or creating something from scratch, I think that you're right. Persistence, consistency, resilience, grit, whatever you want to call it, are important traits and qualities that we need to cultivate. And I think that a large part of that journey entails where they gain that impulsivity for. So I know that the question is really broad, but like,
Yeah.
to think of it like this impulsiveness, this instant gratification or need for it has come from somewhere. We have learned this. So at a macro level, we can think of social media, we can think of, I don't know, maybe like our generation, if they're a certain percentage of the economic status have been indulged by their parents, it's come from somewhere. Instant gratification has come, the need for instant gratification has come from somewhere. So when we're sitting on a one-on-one basis and learning about that person, the questions that we're asking, Hamza, is where did you learn this from? Right? Your sort of attentiveness span, or your inability to sit with failure, or what does failure mean for you, right? Like, is it about pivoting? Is it about quitting? What do these words mean? We often hear a lot of motivational speakers as well talk about, like, don't quit and stick it through. And but these are very generic things that we're pasting out there. Maybe this person who's listening to your podcast or listening to your speech or your talk is in a
Hmm.
really abusive workplace. They do not need to stick it through. They need to leave,
Yeah.
right? Like, there's an element of understanding at a more nuanced level what these words mean for people. So yes, well, I think it's wonderful to create self-compassion, create resilience, persistence. It's important to understand the context of it, right? So today, if you come to me and say, I've changed 7 careers in the last like decade, of course my curiosity is going to peak, not because I want to shame you, but because I want to understand what's causing the constant pivoting, right? Have we not found our passion? Are we someone who is not made for one job? Are we someone who, interdisciplinary work is so it's frowned upon so much here, right? And not so much in the United States. And I've noticed that, a lot of people do multiple things at one time. You can be, a part-time barista as well as a DJ, as well as so many
Right.
things. But in our country, somehow we have to define our streamline, and we have to climb up that goddamn ladder, whether we like it or not, to the highest pinnacle. And I think that that's just unfair. And I know that now things are changing where people are more open to the idea of being more multidisciplinary, being more versatile, being more diverse, having multiple feathers in their hat. And I think that, again, I know I'm losing track of, your existing question, but I think that all of these qualities are great, but we need to understand the relative definition of this and where they learned this from. Like, where did they learn this instant gratification from? Maybe if you
Okay.
grew up with in a household where your father was, say, an alcoholic, right? For them, they have grown up in an environment of unpredictability, inconsistency, and
Right.
instant gratification.
Yep.
That means that I'm going to pick up on, or I'm going to swing the other way, where maybe I'm so consistent and I'm so persistent, and that I'm even in abusive relationships and abusive workplaces, right? So I think that there's an element of, yes, we want to cultivate these traits, but we need to understand our thresholds. And thresholds is very relative based on the context, right? So if a client is coming to me and saying, I'm not able to pull through this, I'm not able to stay at one job, there's got to be a pattern there, right? What our society does is just shames them as either lazy, or it shames them as not hardworking enough, and how can you quit so much? But there's something at such a deeper subconscious level that's happening that you and I, as outsiders, are not privy to. And maybe the client is not as well. Only when they start talking about their job history, when they start talking about the nature of their co-workers, when they start talking about the environments they have placed in, the type of job, their parents and their working relationship with their parents' attitudes, that's when we start to realize a pattern. And usually you'll be surprised that 99.9% of the time there is such a pattern that lies in the midst of all of this that's influencing their behavior. So I think that while there are these generic tools, thumbs up, like, whether it's meditation, whether it is, some form of, a physical exercise or practice that allows you to cultivate it, or yoga, for instance, right, at a biological level,
Mm-hmm.
cultivate perseverance, cultivate all of that, which I'm not shunning. I think they're wonderful tools to use to develop groundedness, and to help your anxiety, to help you make decisions. I think there's a lot of more larger contextual factors that play, that need to be explored. And even if you don't want to do it with a therapist, to do it for yourself, right? Like, where does my impulsivity come from? Have I watched my dad constantly shift jobs, which is why I'm modeling that? Or did my mom stick up? It's such an abusive environment that I believe that sticking up is the only way to success, and that is why I'm sticking up in this. So it's so complex and nuanced, and I think that each individual comes with their own definitions of these words. But overarchingly, to answer your question, yes, I think that these qualities are valuable as we are navigating any aspect of our life, including interpersonal relationships, not just jobs, or just interactions with the people on a day-to-day basis around us.
Great. Something just came into perspective right now. So I was in Goa for 3 days for this transformational thing, and 3 days like a workshop. And right
Okay.
now you spoke about like questioning, like the words that you use, what does that mean in your
Right.
life, right? In a way. And that also got me to this meditation course that I did there about, you not being someone who should put meaning to your thoughts, but an observer rather.
Yeah.
And I related that a lot, and it makes so much sense now. So that's great.
Yeah.
Moving on from like the part where like now you're aware, okay, and you know that you need therapy, but somewhere in your
Right.
life you may be at a place or a position where maybe you can't access it financially,
Yeah.
or you have other family constraints. Some people are just scared because of the stereotype behind it.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
so if I had to ask you, I don't know how simple is it, but like, what do you think are solutions
Hmm.
people can find maybe online or in their day-to-day life, or can they talk to, if not a therapist, somebody else, who can give
Hmm.
them answers? It's a tricky place to be, if you ask me as well, because I have tried
Yeah.
it and it's not that easy. But
Yeah.
what do you think? Where can they find solutions?
I think that so lots of parts to this question,
Yeah.
right? First, yes, deep amounts of stigma associated with anything therapy or therapeutic related. No matter how far we've come along, in this whole mental health awareness and advocacy journey, I know that COVID really sort of pushed a lot of mental health content onto social media, along with people, some talking about it with more grace and more awareness, some just talking about it, right? But it came to the forefront in a lot of ways, and I think that despite of that, there is deep amounts of stigma at a micro level, where you'll hear your auntie say that you don't need it and that you can talk to her, as well as at a macro level, where you can see that despite of the mental health laws and the act that was passed in, I believe, 2017, a lot of that is lost in translation. So they're showing you in that, okay, you know what, now we're going to talk about this. There is large amounts of parity between how a medical profession is treated and a therapist is treated. We are considered to be subsidiary, allied, peripheral, on the side, complementary. These are terms that at an institutional level are used for these services, which automatically are telling you you are lower down on the rung. You are not as important as a surgeon. You are not. So there's a lot of medical
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy. Even today, you will reach out to today if you tell your mother you have a knot in your stomach, she might not, her mind is not going to go to anxiety. Her mind is going to go to, we have to call up the GP and find out maybe it's a gastro issue. That's
Yeah.
just how we're trained. Again, goes back to that sort of cultural conditioning, cultural programming piece of it, right? So I think that there is a lot of stigma. There is, at a micro and a macro level, a lot of discrimination. There is a lack of access and affordability, right? Like, going back to a part of your question, a dearth of qualified and credible, and I'm specifically saying that qualified and credible because it's a very unregulated space. Right? Therapy in India is not a regulated space. It is not like the United States. It's not like the UK or other parts where there is just how doctors have licensure here. Okay, therapists don't need to have, and now, yes, there are a few changes for certain sections and all, but in the larger scheme of things, we don't have a very regulated process, which means there are a lot of people out there who can sell this as a service, okay, but not be doing justice to the work or might not be qualified and credible, right? So again, filtering out that when you're reaching out to find someone is learning about their background. Please, can you tell me your qualifications? um, what are your charges? Where do you practice from? You'll be surprised that a lot of quote unquote therapists, will come to your house, which actually in a lot of ways can be unsafe. There's a lot of lack
Correct.
of regulation or dysregulation that one needs to be informed about as they reach out to find any support. But going back to, again, one part of your question is the lack of access and affordability. We have very few for the large, for how largely and densely populated we are as a country. We're very few because, again, it's a cyclical problem, right? No one's encouraging people to become therapists because it's not that well paying in the larger scheme of things, or you're not as well respected as, say, a doctor. Lesser people are going to become it, lesser people are going to provide the service, and we yet continue to need a lot of mental health infrastructure in the country. And there is a lack of affordability because you're paying out of pocket, right? And very few institutions and organizations today, and I'm saying today means in the last 6 months, are now, and again, organizations that you would consider to be either startups or organizations that have a lot of social justice at their ethos. They're the ones saying, okay, maybe we'll reimburse X percentage of your therapy cost, right? Because they're now beginning to put a little bit of that insurance piece into practice. For majority of it is out of pocket. So your therapist is charging you a hefty fee because therapy is a luxury in this country. When you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food and safety are at the bottom, right? Your self evolution and your self actualization is all on top. We're a country with
Right.
deep amounts of poverty. We're yet at the bottom. So asking somebody who is working day in and day out to feed their children 2 meals, they're not going to pay X thousand rupees, for 1 hour to talk about how depressed they feel. They don't have that language. They're not as privileged. So therapy is a privilege. And I
Right.
think that all of these at an institutional level is what we're kind of advocating for, fighting for, because when you just simply think of insurance as a concept, right? If the government pays us for our services, we can offer them at more subsidized rates, and larger people can access and can be more affordable. But you can say at an institutional level how you're discouraged, right? That you're not incentivized, you're discouraged to go to a therapist because of not just stigma, but also that. On a slightly positive note, there are a lot of therapists who do, pro bono services. They do something called sliding scale, which is they give you a, they charge according to your income. So like they'll make you fill out what your annual income is, and based on that, a certain percentage is what they charge you. So it's more relative and
Correct.
contextual and individualized to the person. So there are a lot of services that can be pro bono, that can be sliding scale. And yes, therapists in Mumbai, and I only speak from Mumbai because larger parts of, in India, I'm not really sure of what the services look like just yet, but there are therapists that do that. The number is small. They're usually overworked. They technically in some way are paying a cost for not being paid, say their actual fee, or a fee that maybe feels more compensatory to them. But just like any other social justice or NGO organization, there are services of that nature. I just think that they're harder to find. I think they're usually booked out, or they're working on overtime. And that again impacts the relationship you have with your therapist, right? Because there are very few, that they're overworked. You're finding for that slot. It becomes the ethos of therapy, instead of it being abundance and a safe space to introspect, sometimes can become that of scarcity. Sometimes therapists will say, I can only see you for 10 sessions because I have X number of people I need to see in a year because it's a pro bono service. So it's a lot
Mhm.
of institutional factors at play. But I think for people that are hoping to seek that support at a time when they have the resources to do so, really, especially in this country, especially to check and to learn about their therapists before they start the service, right? In terms of how qualified they are, what is their credibility, what kind of therapy do they offer. These are some basic questions to ask, like what are the confidentiality policies. You notice a lot of therapists here will not, either verbally or in a written document, confidentiality is a construct, has to be discussed, right? And so these are some of the basic premises that someone should be informed about as they're therapy shopping, or as they're looking to find someone to support them. I'm not going to answer any questions about like life coaches, because I know you said any kind of solution. I know there are life coaches, I know there are gurus, there are all other permutations and combinations that I think, or alternative um, services that can really, really assist someone who is experiencing any kind of distress. And I think that it's for you to figure out what works best. Like a life coach, for instance, is going to be similar to therapeutic practices, yet different, because they're more directional, they're trained very differently. If that's the thing you feel like you need, again, question mark on, is this person qualified? To make sure that they haven't just done, a 1 hour online certificate and are charging you exorbitant amounts for their advice. It's important that you do a decent amount of a background check of your professionals. We don't have a tendency to do that here because we believe in this whole white coat submission, which is, oh, you are a doctor, oh, you are a life coach, now you are going to save us and rescue us. So feeling a little more empowered about your mental health is very important.
Wow, that's a lot of
Yeah.
information that you've put in,
Mm.
like, I think very precisely and clearly.
Yeah.
And I think it's like serves like a checklist in a way, uh, especially this
So
answer,
true.
that they can
Yeah.
sort of just listen to this and they know what all they need to look out for very easily, very simply. So thank you for that. Uh, to end
Yeah.
this podcast, there was this documentary that I was recently seeing by Jonah Hill, and he sort of created it
Hmm.
on his therapist. The whole
Okay.
documentary was based on that. And in the beginning, he talks about, how there are certain tools that every therapist has,
Hmm.
and they sort of promote. So, are there any specific tools that sort of you promote or someone can utilize as a universal tool to solve a lot of problems,
Mm.
or is there one specific tool for
Mm.
one problem? Do you have any of those?
Mm. See, I have mixed feelings about the word tool as well, but I think that it's not going to directly answer your question, and I'll try to keep this as succinct and short as possible. But
Yeah.
to think of every therapist is trained in a certain modality. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, if there is, say, for instance, one of them is like cognitive behavioral therapy, one of them is psychodynamic, what Freud founded. So, a bunch of, a bunch of, white men, but also, other theorists over being trained. And when you're working, you realize that there are some, as you call, psychotechniques, or there are, certain modalities or orientations or frameworks that you subscribe to more than others,
Okay.
and it works for you. So for instance, I'll give you one example. Like when you think of, again, this is very reductionist, it's not all encompassing, but someone who's trained specifically in CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, there is a certain way they are going to deal with a client's concern or challenge when they bring that into the room, right? Their framework of looking at the concern is going to be, okay, what is a thought this is evoking? Okay, this thought is, impacting and influencing this, behavior. Okay, this behavior is impacting, this is why you're behaving this. So they have like a certain model that they are going to, sort of like your cognition, your behaviors, and your thoughts. Sort of this is how it's all landing in together. Versus say someone who is more person centered, which is just, for instance, another kind of theory. Their approach is going to be maybe more unconditional listening. It's going to be more of, letting the client coming up with the solution. So everyone's got their own orientation. I think that in today's world, a lot of people use something called eclectic, like they mixed theories from, different, just like when you study, business, right? You have a bunch of theorists talking about a bunch of things about
Yep.
marketing, and, some things land and some things don't land. And you realize that for my business, I'm going to use this theory, and then I'm going to use that theory. And I think that this is very beneficial in a South Asian context. And you're going to mix it all together. So it's eclectic. I specifically truly enjoy, as an academic interest as well as then, my orientation is very non-directional. So it's very divergent from, say, more CBT oriented work. It's non-directional, it's non-diagnostic, unless a client really needs a diagnosis, because it's going to help them either for insurance purposes or school purposes or something. And it's Gestalt and existentialist. A little broad, I'll break that down for you. Gestalt specifically has a bunch of tools, but the one I enjoy the most is what we call the here and now technique. So the here and now technique talks about the idea that when a client comes in, after 2 or 3 sessions, you pick up on the way the therapy session is going on. And the way they're interacting with you is a fertile ground for how some of their interpersonal relationships are going to be outside the
Wow.
therapeutic session.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's a little bit of having like this third eye and watching the dynamic here. So say for instance, a man comes in and he's talking about, a concern that he has with females in general, and you're a female therapist here. And so the way he's interacting you is giving you a fertile ground of the data, okay, of maybe how he is with other women, even though
Mm-hmm.
he's saying it to you. What's happening in the here and now is so telling of just maybe some of the symptoms, some of their pathologies, some of their concerns, challenges, the way they interact. So that's one of my favorites, because I think that it's giving you a live representation of your client. Like they're bringing themselves into the work, which I think is really powerful. So the here and now is one aspect of Gestalt, along with large amounts of, parts work. Parts work is, okay, this part of you wants to do this, but I'm wondering what this part is telling you. So, sometimes when we're trying to resolve conflict, there's one part of me that wants, especially, so okay, let's just take social anxiety. One part of me really wants to go to this party. She's this really cool girl that's invited me, but the other part is really, really scared. And so we draw out these parts. So we exaggerate these parts. Sometimes in our clinic, we even perform these parts. It's called the empty chair technique. We put 2 chairs and we make our clients sort of oscillate. Okay, so one part is saying, I'm really anxious and I'm not confident, I can't. And then the other one flips over and says, but you can really do this because you want to be, a popular girl, whatever it is, right? So understanding our parts and where they come from, I think is really important, because a large part of all of these mental health diagnoses involves parts clashing against each other. Right. So there's one part of me that's anxious, there's one part of me that's confident, there's one part of me that's shamed, but there's also one part of me that's, I don't know, resilient. And so learning about our different parts and how they can all work in a coherent narrative rather than constantly cause anxiety or panic or depression or all of these, words we use very casually, um, is an interesting, again, as you said, tool or a psychotechnique that we is something that I found beneficial in a lot, just to understand your different parts. And you can do this yourself as well, right? Like when you're problem solving, when you're trying to make a decision, what part is holding me back? What part is, encouraging me to do this? Whose voice is this? A lot of times our parts are our parents' voices or our guardians' voices or our teachers' voices. So it's interesting as we learn more about our psyche, about our subconscious. But yeah, there are so many beautiful ones out there. These are just two that I know I subscribe to more often, because I find really beautiful, results. Even body work, where do you feel it in your body? Can you describe it? Or the anxiety feels like this silver coil cord, that's intertwined, and then we give that a little life. So some of the parts work, body work, here and now work is what I enjoy, but there are some really beautiful tools and techniques out there to learn more about yourself.
Wow. Okay. Uh, I think that's about it, like from the questions that I had to ask you
Right.
specifically. And I would never ever consider to get so much information in such a short amount of time. I think
Yeah.
you've like packed in so much in like this short podcast. And because what I try to do is keep it limited, because I know that when it comes to podcasts, people don't have,
Right.
that capacity to listen for a long amount of time.
Sure.
So your ability as a podcaster isn't to put maximum information in the minimum amount of
Hmm.
time. and you've really
Right.
helped me with that. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here once again.
I'm glad.
And I am going to
Yeah.
put in all your information when I post this podcast. It's going to be on YouTube as well,
Sure.
and the audio version
Sure.
is going to be on Spotify, so everybody can listen to it. And
Yeah.
even the Mind Health page is going to be included, so people can go and see all the beautiful content that you're putting out there. Thank you
Yeah.
once again.
Thank you for having me, Hamza. Hopefully I tried to succinctly put all the information I could and string it together into a narrative that hopefully wasn't verbose. And I hope that people that are listening can take away whatever resonates most with them.
Thank you, Ria, and hope to connect with you soon,
Okay.
maybe in another
Yes,
podcast.
definitely. Thank you, Hamza. Have
Thank
a good
you.
evening.
Good evening.
Bye.
Bye.